Click the bell icon to get latest videos from Ekeeda.
Hello friends, today we will talk about weak entity sets in a database model and designing. What is weak entity set? When we apply for weak entity set, how to design the weak entity set in an ERD, and finally what are the constraints that we need to put while designing the weak entity set. Weak entity sets, we consider it as the strong entity set and from which it can be derived. Let us take an example first to specify the definition of a weak entity set. First, if we look at the relation section and course. So the course contains the course ID, the course name, and the department to which the course belongs. And the section relation consists of the section ID, the course ID, the semester and year. Let's look at this. Now let's look at this relation. Obviously, section is a direct implementation of the course relation, as the course ID belongs to both of it, and a section is invalid without the course ID because section is formed within a course. So we can say that section is a part of the course, is not a relation that exists individually other than the relation course. That makes it a weak entity set because the entity section is generally have is infrastructure built on another relation, that is course. See, that is definitely different from the derived relation. Derived relation is if you have all the information on an attribute, we can derive it from another one. But this is not the case here. This is the relation is built on the information that belongs to another relation. Now, the section ID, semester, and year, these three field or attributes are the individual attributes that belongs to the section, and the course ID that we reference it from the course relation. So what we can do, we need to establish a relationship between these two relations and say that is say course relation. So the sec course relation relate the section and course tables or relation. Now, what happens if we can refer the course ID from the course to the section? So the sec course is generally redundant. What do you mean by redundant? That the information is getting duplicated. We do not need an explicit relationship set course to have between section and course, as we can refer from the section to which course belongs by the course ID of that particular course. Now what to do? We can do one thing, that we are removing this relationship sec course, but then we have the sec course as an attribute. As for the designing process of an ERD, we have mentioned that we can change the relationship to an attribute or choose an alternative between them, that we can have now sec course as an attribute or another relation to the section and course both, so that we can know that which section is referred to which course. Now that we can relate the section and course very clearly, but the problem is that we are actually having redundant attribute. So if I want to delete the redundant relationship, it will arise with an redundant attribute. That is also not desirable. So the need of the weak entity set arises. So now the definition of a weak entity set, we can properly define that a weak entity set is an entity which is dependent on another entity in the database. The referring or the identifying entity is known as the strong entity as for this course one, and the referred or the dependent entity is known as the weak entity. Now, the weak entity set is always said to be existence dependent on strong entity set. So we can say that the section is existence dependent on course. That means we cannot have the existence of section without the existence of course, because it is not about having this section as an individual entity. The section cannot happen to exist if there is no course that we can teach in that section. So the section is obviously existence dependent on course that we have proved. Now that we have mentioned the set weak entity, we need to define it properly. We should eliminate the referring key from the strong entity set, that is the primary key of that entity, from the weak entity set, and to left with all the individual attributes to include in the weak entity set. So now my weak entity set section looks like. So the sec ID, semester and year, these three are the attributes of my weak entity set section. So how can we define in the ERD that a being set is a strong one or a weak one? The strong entity set has the main advantage that it has got the primary key in it. When we are talking about the course relation, we can clearly see that course ID is the primary key which can uniquely identify the relation or a tuple in a relation. Now for the section, there is no primary key that we can see. So it is entirely dependent on the strong entity set or its existence referring set. So when we are mentioning the relation between them, the relationship that exists is also a weak relationship existence. Now that we have this sec ID same and here, we can tell us that the total participation is there from the section to the course. If there is any relationship between this section and course, say the sec course relation, then the relation has a total participation. That means all the attributes of this attributing relation should always refer to the strong entity set relation. So now we can say that section is totally dependent on the course. Now let's come to discriminator portion. Even also the section or the weak entity set has not got any type of primary key to uniquely identify the relation or the tuples, but they has the discriminator. What do you mean by discriminator? Discriminator are the set of attributes that we can have within a weak entity set that tries to define the uniqueness among the weak entity sets tuple. But the main difference is it does not got that the primary key, and now also it is dependent entirely on the primary key on the strong entity set. But to uniquely identify the tuples on particularly a weak entity set, we need the set of attributes as a discriminator to the weak entity set. So for our relation, we can say that the combination of the sec ID, same and here, these three both together forms the discriminator of the weak entity set section. Now for the discriminator 2, it has also got the total participation from the section weak entity set to the strong entity set course. Now we can say that the section ID is globally accepted as a unique one to the university. So we can obviously argue that why sec ID cannot be the primary key of the relation section. It can happen that the section ID be the primary key of the relation section, but the relation section, the existence of the relation section is dependent on the course relation. So we cannot have the sections without the course. That is why it becomes a weak entity. And now the section ID cannot uniquely identify the tuples in a section without any course. So we need to have the primary key of the strong entity set, that is the course ID, to uniquely identify each of the tuple. So the clear definition of a weak entity set is the discriminator will define the uniqueness to the particular weak entity set, but for having the total information or record, we have to include the primary key of the strong entity set to have the unique record of section. So when I'm referring to section, section A has got in semester 4 of year 2009, but with course 101 that gives the full information. Otherwise, it will give an incomplete information which is not desirable on having a database. Now, let us first draw an ERD to actually have the database for the weak entity set. Now, let's look at the ERD for a weak entity set. What are the changes that we can see? First, the course is an divided rectangle with the relation and the primary key as CID and course name and department as other relation. Let's look at this section which is being a weak entity set in this ERD. So the section has got the section as the relation name, but let's look at this attribute sec id semester year. Now for the discriminator, as it also divides the uniqueness that we are underlining, but not with a solid line but with a dashed line. Here the primary key is identified with a solid line, but now I am identifying all the discriminator with a dashed line, not a solid line. Now the double line specifies the total participation for the section to the course. And it also has the many to one relation from section to course, because there can lie many section on a particular course on any batch or any of the other students. So we are identifying it with an arrow towards the course. Now comes to the diamond. The sec-course relation is consisted within a double diamond which supports the weak entity relation on the ERD. So now we can say that the weak entity set is divided into a rectangle, just not as a normal field on the entity set, but the discriminator is underlined with a dashed one. The total participation is presented by the double line, and the double diamond shows the weak entity relationship between them. So this is the formation of ERD in a weak entity set. Now that the weak entity is being dependent to a strong entity set, but the identifying relationship set, we can uniquely connect it or getting relation it with other relations without being related it to the identifying set. Say for example that section is now a weak entity set. So other than using the term weak, if we can look at the term entity set, that means it is an object. It has its existence. Maybe it is dependent on some other relation, but it is existing. Now the section can perform or get related to another relations without being related to the strong entity set. Say for example that section which can be related to the time slot, to the section filled on that particular time slot, so that we have the ID, the sec ID for the reference, and then we can have the building, the room number and all. So the time slot can be related to the section without any relation to the course. So in this way, it is not mandatory that always to get related to another relationship, a weak entity set must first derive a relationship to the strong entity set. Without having so, it can just relate it to other relations in the database. Now then, how to combine it with the primary key of that strong entity set? So, the primary key of a weak entity set consists of the primary key on the strong entity set along with the discriminator of that particular weak entity set. So, we can say that the primary key of the weak entity set section from the CID as well as the discriminators sec ID same and year. Now the section's primary key is formed with the sec ID, CID same and here. So it can uniquely identify the sections to have relation with other tables. Now some designers avoid being attributing a weak entity set, just have a multi-valued composite attribute or part of the relation. Say for example that we made the section not as another different entity set but as a composite attribute to the relation course. If we do so, we can just add it to the section, but we cannot have in multiple values against the section. So we cannot have multiple section IDs. The semester and year though can be multi-valued. Now that we cannot have all the attributes as a multi-valued one, we cannot include in this way the multi-valued composite attribute to the referring relation. We have to make a weak entity set to do it very smoothly, perfectly, and concisely. So that is all for the weak entity set in a database designing purpose. Thank you for watching this video. Stay tuned with Ekeeda and subscribe to Ekeeda.